this on, giving us the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Reigle. I'm a shareholder with Meissner, Tierney, Nichols. You already heard from Tom Nichols, our president, at the town meeting event today. And if you recognize the dulcet tone of his voice, you probably heard him. He does our radio ads on WISF. So, we're going to be talking today about how do I grow my business without needing to lay out cash. So in the past, we've talked about how to raise capital, what are the strategies for that. Today, we're going to be talking about things that you can do to grow your business that don't require you to actually lay out cash. So I'm going to turn it over to Adam in a minute to introduce our topic a little bit more, and these three gentlemen are going to kind of take you through some different scenarios and some different strategies that you can employ. Then I think of that as sort of the offensive side of this. At the end of that, I'm going to come back in and I'm going to talk more about what we think is the defensive side. So, but for right now, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to tell us a little bit more about our topic.
My name is Adam Tutaj. I'm a shareholder here with Meissner Tierney. I'm joined by Ryan Cooley and Sievert, two of our corporate executive associates. And as Scott alluded to, I want to talk a bit about this notion of cashless growth, and more specifically, what's it going to take to be able to grow your business without at least upfront cash. One of the first slides I wanted to kind of open the screen here. So there was an article in the Harvard Business Review about 40 plus years ago now called "The 5 Stages of Small Business Growth." While many of the particulars of management and organizational theory have evolved since, the 5 essential steps here will seem familiar to a lot of small business owners. It starts with coming into existence, moves on to survival, a couple phases of success as you catch hold, and then this idea of takeoff and growth to a final level of resource maturity. And one of the key indicators of the growth is the degree to which the owner is central to the day-to-day management of business, progressing from functional, direct supervision, day in, day out, is the one-stop shop, centralized management does everything, to a more diffuse or functional or line and staff type structure. But to get to this point, to the point where you can enjoy your hard work and have others to help to manage that business and grow it, you need to have the necessary human resources. And that means key employees and trusted managers. Securing talent through the expenditure of gobs of cash can certainly be effective. Spending gobs of cash has been effective for a lot of purposes, if you've got that to spend. But if cash is scarce, there are other mechanisms for attracting and retaining the talent necessary to grow your business from a wholly owned and managed operation to a more self-sufficient enterprise. And so this notion of cashless growth that we're describing here in terms of growing your human resources to grow the business, we're referring to using equity and synthetic equity as a means of securing those key employees and managers. Now, admittedly, there will be a point in time where these mechanisms will be reduced to cash, but these will be typically at a future point where the enterprise has grown, and reached an acquisitive event where there will be the cash available to reward the employees. Now, Dan and Ryan are going to be giving a high-level overview of what these look like from the standpoint of operations, and I expect that some of these terms and models that they're going to be describing will be familiar to you. If you've ever looked at these forms of equity and synthetic equity programs, you've probably come across the term 409A in your travels. We're not going to inflict a great deal of tax analysis on you today, but in short, 409A is a provision of the Internal Revenue Code which applies to all businesses, small and large. Whether that was the intent or should be the case is another story, but the reality is it applies to all businesses regardless of size. And it essentially imposes certain requirements on deferred compensation arrangements. Typically, one of the hallmarks of which is a substantial risk of forfeiture if some of the events don't come to pass. The failure to satisfy these requirements under 409A can lead to some pretty nasty outcomes. That's particularly true for the employees themselves. Namely, if you don't qualify, the amount that was otherwise deferred as income can come racing back into their income into the earliest open year plus there's the penalties. So making sure that these functions got to tick all the boxes from a tax standpoint is important. Another consideration that might be engaged is security law rules. We covered a lot of this, last year in some of our provisions regarding actual raising of capital. But in this setting here, depending on the nature of the program, whether it's real equity or synthetic equity, you may or may not have a security on your hands. But in all events, when you propose to compensate an individual based on economic performance or value of the firm, a certain level of financial disclosure is going to be engaged, and when you have an obligation to disclose financials, you also have an obligation to be truthful with respect to those financials to avoid, misleading statements. Lastly, when we talk about when we bring these people in as key managers and key employees, you're not only making these individuals assets of the firm, you're also making them potential competitive threats. And so it is important to consider a variety of restricted covenants as part of this process. The most common forms of restricted covenants are going to be confidentiality agreements, which essentially are just, they say, it's an obligation for some period of time for the employee post-termination or separation to keep certain information confidential. There are non-compete agreements, and by non-compete, I mean as distinct from non-solicitation, which we'll talk about in a second. Non-competition is truly you're out of this space, this competitive space. Whatever it is you're doing now in this area as an employee, you're not doing it for a period of time. You are no longer going to be in this competitive space for a period of time. Non-solicitation is kind of a subset of that. Rather than being completely, say, knocked out of an industry, what you are prohibited from doing is soliciting particular individuals, whether they be clients, employees, and the like. And lastly, non-disparagement agreements. As we've all seen, in the most recent years now, a number of states have started becoming far more restrictive than they ever have been. There are now 4 states that have, virtually, very broad prohibitions. It used to just be California. Now it's California, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Oklahoma. 9 other states, plus the District of Columbia, have got prohibitions based on income that essentially say unless you hit a certain level of income or your salary instead of hourly, you can't put a non-compete on employees. That's distinct from some other restricted covenants like non-solicitation, but they put but it's becoming more limited. Then among the several other states that do simply impose a variety of reasonableness restrictions, Wisconsin ranks as one of the most stringent because we do not apply what's called the blue pencil rule. In many other states that just have simple reasonableness requirements, if you miss the mark, a court might reform your non-compete. You said 20 miles, they thought 15 is more reasonable, they'll go right up to 15 miles. Now Wisconsin, if you miss it, this is as good as a mile. If you're overbroad in any respect, they will throw the whole thing out. That's subject to certain tailoring things you can do if you separate your covenants. You can separate your non-solicitation, your non-compete, maybe to have a chance of preserving some of those, but Wisconsin used to be one of the most restrictive states. Now I'd say we're probably falling from second to, 15th most restrictive state, since we at least still allow them. And lastly, you've probably seen in the news, the FTC rule that has come out. It has been trumpeted as, essentially banning non-competes nationwide. That hasn't come into effect yet. I think there's a pretty significant airball right now as to whether or not that will ever come into effect, but until it does, and until an injunction comes through, that is a set of restrictions that everyone's got to at least keep in back of mind here. But all these rules we're talking about here, when we say these restrictions on restricted covenants, these are all in the realm of employment. Okay, so that governs your employment relationship. But that doesn't necessarily apply the same way to ownership arrangements. And so when you're dealing with equity and synthetic equity rights, those may support a covenant that is separate and apart from employment. It could be longer, it could be more protective of your interest. So essentially, similar as if I were to buy a company outright from somebody, I get a much broader restriction than if they were my mere employee. We've seen some of this too in the FTC rule that says, okay, well, they don't want this to people to go nuts and just call everybody an owner and give them a little tiny piece of ownership. But that is how a lot of ownership structures work. We'll see if the FTC rule holds on this, but at least right now, say in Wisconsin, you can make a distinction between employment and ownership, and with the ownership restrictions being separate from that. And that's a topic that Scott's going to talk about towards the end here. I should say as we move on here, if there are any questions, feel free to throw your hands up in the air. We'll address them as we go, but otherwise we'll certainly stick around for a few minutes after the presentation as well if anybody wants to stop and see us. But with that, I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Dan and Brian.
Thanks, Adam. So the first type of plan that we want to talk about today is the restricted stock unit. The restricted stock unit plan is effectively a promise to pay contractual rights to stock in the future, subject to a vesting requirement. This vesting requirement can manifest itself in one of two different ways. This can be either a time-based vesting, certain types of shares that will vest over 1 to 5 years, or it can be a performance-based vesting requirement, either measured through company performance or individual performance. So let's say the company's EBITDA, net income, goes by a certain percentage or hits a certain metric, the shares can vest or it can be tied to a specific shareholder achieving some type of sales goal or different type of individual performance. So broadly speaking, that's what a restricted stock unit is. Now briefly, let's look at an example of what that is. Brian, do you mind going through this example here?
Yeah, absolutely. So consider a company. You have ABC Inc. And you'll notice we weren't very creative. ABC hires Adam in June of 2020, and he grants him 5,000 RSUs. Now, they've chosen to vest these based on time, so every 1 year of service, and 20% of the RSUs vest in equal installments. So June every single year, 2021, 2022, etc. So in June 2021, 1,000 RSUs vest and they become Adams. So let's say, for example, in June 2021, if the share price is $50, the tax year 2021, Adam realizes $50,000 ordinary income. That simple calculation is $50 times the 1,000 shares. Obviously, correspondingly, ABC Inc. receives the deduction in the same year. This happens every single year for the remainder of the vesting schedule. So, 2022, same, assuming the share price is the exact same, $50. It would be another $50,000 ordinary income. Share price goes up, share price goes down. The numbers are a little bit different, but the schedule is essentially the same. 2022 through 2023.
Note that example that Adam did not get cash. Adam just got stock, which he will have, which he owns and has a value, and he will now have a basis because it's been taxed to him. But he owns, cash is still TBD.
So then, broadly speaking, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of a restricted stock unit plan? Well, I think as we've just briefly discussed in about a minute or so to describe it, it's relatively simple to understand. You can structure this type of plan to vest, to incentivize employees either through a time-based requirement, keeping them engaged as employees, or it can be performance-based, tied to company metrics or individual metrics.
One of the other things that are a significant advantage for RSUs is because these are a right to future shares, again, Adam mentioned that there's no cash changing hands when the shares vest. The employee can't lose the total value of their compensation unless the value of the shares themselves go to zero. So for instance, with a certain type of option, if you have, for example, a strike price of $10, and when you are vested and you think about, do I want to exercise these, if the price of the share at that time is, let's say, $8, you're essentially in a position where you don't want to exercise your option because you're underwater. Well, because this is not cash, it's shares, you can't go below zero like that, unless the company itself goes to zero. And not only the employee, but the company itself has a problem.
Like Adam mentioned at the top, Section 409A does require some careful administration in this plan. And that's an obvious disadvantage. Will be a consistent theme throughout this. But one of the other disadvantages to an RSU plan is that there is no cash infusion to the company. The employee itself isn't purchasing these shares. Adam is now $50,000 to the company, capital contributed to the company for these shares. But then also, one of the disadvantages to this setup is that there is ordinary income treatment in the at the share vest. Obviously, this is a little bit of a disadvantage compared to any kind of capital asset treatment, but there are other types of plans that perhaps deal with these disadvantages, and one of which is the incentive stock option. Brian, why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so incentive stock options, these are abbreviated as ISOs. These are one of the things we just mentioned. An employee has the right to buy a specified number of company shares for a specific price. That's called the strike price. Now, let's actually go to the example. So we're with Adam again, not very creative. ABC is still hiring Adam, it's still June 2022. This time, instead of a right to future units, they grant him an option to purchase 5,000 shares at a $20 strike price. One of the things about incentive stock options is that they can be eligible for favorable tax treatment, which is one of the things that we're going to explore versus the other kinds of stock options in the future. But Adam exercised his option to purchase all 5,000 shares, or ISOs, in June 2022. And at that time, the fair market value in our example is $50 per share. The tax advantage of the incentive stock option is at the time of exercise, it does not trigger any income tax realization to the employee to add. So if he holds the shares until the fair market value is $100 per share in June of 2024, and then sold all 5,000, that's $500,000 of proceeds. It's instead taxed at a long-term capital gains rate of $400,000, which is the $500,000 proceeds minus the $100,000 is basis in year 2024. That's the tax advantage.
As you can see, this is a pretty useful mechanism in a very early stage company when the price is very low. If the value is very low, you can get that initial option to be a very low price.
So obviously, there's going to be a distinct advantage to any type of tax structure, comparing ordinary rates versus capital gains rates. But one of the other unique advantages. Oh, sorry, do you have a question? Or?
Yeah, you can go ahead and finish your thought.
Okay. One of the other unique advantages is that an ISO has to be exercised by an employee, albeit somebody has 90 days after termination to exercise the option as well. But typically this is an employee incentive option, equity compensation plan.
Sure, just a question on the ISO structures. Like you mentioned the company was much smaller, very low price, grows over time. There's also like a $100,000 limitation before it becomes an on-call. Is that based on the issuance, or is that based on exercise? When is that $100,000? I'm just thinking like if you've got a very low price and then it becomes very high, how does that play into the non-call?
Sure, so the example you're using, 100,000, that's based on the actual price. I'm buying at the granted exercise price. For that example was $20, but it honestly could be $1.25 if that was the value at the time it was granted. And then the difference is simply I've got a very low basis, but I pay a lot for it.
Sure.
Yeah, so in other words, the $100,000 is the grant date, not the exercise date. So, and that's
So it doesn't matter if it grows, it just matters if
it matters that grant date, and that's aggregated if you have multiple issuances of ISOs, you have to aggregate those values at the grant date to evaluate the $100,000. Like you teed up, I think we're going to get to non-statutory stock options and what happens when we go past that $100,000 limit. So, great question. And that kind of just leads me into one of the other disadvantages of an ISO, and that is the Section 422 requirements. Because this does have a pretty good built-in tax savings, there are some rigid requirements to execute an ISO plan. These are all laid out through, or primarily laid out through Section 422, but some of this real briefly, and I don't want to bore you, but it's worth pointing out that this ISO plan has to be a written document specifying a whole host of different things, such as the maximum aggregate number of issuable shares. You have to specify the employees or the class of employees employees that will be able to be eligible. And then also this is a 10-year duration that is subject to shareholder approval 12 months pre or post adoption plan. And then also when we're executing the ISO option, we cannot tie the option price to anything less than 100% of fair market value at the date of grant. So there are other different types of plans that, different types of structures that address that fair market value, or that 100% fair market value cap. But within the ISO itself, we can't set the strike price of less than 100% of fair market value.
Some of the additional cons are that the employee has to exercise the option while they are still an employee or within 3 months after leaving the company. That's a coin of two faces. That also serves to keep the employees in the company or force them to divest after they leave. There's an advantage to the employer there. We mentioned the $100,000 rule. The employee can't exercise ISO options totaling more than $100,000 in a given taxable year. So that's a restriction on this type of option that would not show up in other types of options to secure that favorable tax treatment. There's also a holding period. The employee can't sell the stock until 2 years after the grant and 1 year after the exercise. So Dan's got an example based on that. If you want to go back to the example slide. So in 2020, Adam, June 2020, he gets the grant. He has to wait 2 years after that. 2 years after the grant and 1 year after the exercise. So June 2022, if he exercises, if he's granted in June 20, he has to wait until June 2022.
And one final disadvantage to an ISO is that this is generally not available to limited liability companies or partnerships. There are certain other types of equity grant structures that are available in LLCs, but any type of ISO plan should be regarded as something within the default status and non-statutory stock option, which we'll talk about later. But for right now, let's talk about briefly an employee stock purchase plan that deals with some of the disadvantages of the ISO.
So before we move on to that, I just want to slow up because there's a lot of content here. So just want to make sure we're getting any questions that anybody might have before we move on.
So employee stock purchase plans, you can think of this like a 401k. It's a broad-based stock plan that allows employees to use after-tax dollars. So if you're familiar with a traditional 401k that uses pre-tax dollars, that's a bit of a difference, to acquire their company stock. So another little difference in a 401k where you might have a group of funds you can invest in, or even any fund if it's self-directed. The other additional thing about an employee stock purchase plan that is an advantage is that you can purchase the shares for a discount, typically up to 15%.
All right, so what does that look like in an example? So Adam's back with his company ABC, and he's enrolled in his PP in June 2020, and he has $100 withdrawn from each paycheck, with the plan adopting a 15% discount at purchase date. Now, the important thing to note within a USPP is that there will be purchases along a purchase period, typically a year, across 2 different exercise periods. So, if we assume within the example here that at the enrollment date there is a share price of $10, that's for 6 months in December 2022, share price is $20. A little bit of a turmoil. Now we're back down to share price of $8 6 months later. If we have this purchase period, and Adam's company purchases the shares in December 2022, according to an UPP plan, that 15% discount is going to be applied to one of 2 different share prices. It's either going to be at the enrollment date or it's going to be at the purchase price date. So we can see here that the share price has done some major swings, but Adam is going to apply that 15% discount at the enrollment date price for a total share price of $8.50 per share. But 6 months later, the share price is dipped below the enrollment date price, and thus he uses that purchase price date and applies a 15% discount for a share price of $6.80. Now that's a lot of math, but the one key takeaway to have from this example is that you have the flexibility on a 50% discount, but then also when in the year that those purchases are made, Adam does not realize income on those purchases. Those shares will have a realization event only upon occurrence, only upon year of sale. So, threw a lot at you, but to just summarize a little bit, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of an ESPP plan? Brian, why don't you just...
So the big one is it's a payroll election, like we mentioned, just like a 401k. One thing to note is that unlike a 401k, the employee's taxable income is not reduced by the amount withheld to purchase the company shares. So that's a big difference. In addition, you get the discount. So you come up to the register, you get up to 15% discount. That's tremendous for the employees, which is also fantastic for the employer to offer to the employee. And then, if they're qualified under Section 423, the employee is not taxed at the time the shares are purchased. If it's non-qualified, the employee is taxed on the spread. What that is the fair market value of the shares minus the option price, as ordinary.
In both options, they would give dividends, is that correct? Once the purchase stock, you don't have to
Correct.
Now, some of the disadvantages to the ESPP plan is that, for one, this is not something that can be taken advantage of by employees holding more than 5% or more of either voting or different types of classes of stock. But then also, perhaps one of the biggest disadvantages is that there is a $25,000 limit on purchases per year. But that being said, there's a different type of option plan that could address this different type of limit, and that is the non-statutory stock option. Now, we've already talked about the incentive stock option plan and the non-statutory stock option shares a lot of similarities, but perhaps one of the biggest ways to explain the difference between an ISO and an NSO is to just demonstrate that through Adam back at ABC.
It's June 2020, still, again, however you want to think about it. Adam is hired by ABC. They grant him an option to purchase 5,000 shares, $50 strike price. He exercises those options in June 2022. The fair market value at that time is $100 per share. This time, different from the ISO, where he did not realize any ordinary income. Instead, Adam realizes $250,000 of ordinary income. That's the difference between the strike price and the fair market value of the share at that time. Later on, if he holds the shares for the period, let's say it's June 2024, and then he sells all shares for $200, the rest of that is long-term capital gains, which is the difference in fair market value at the time of sale minus the adjusted basis. That's $500,000 for his example.
Now, some of the advantages of this NSO structure, like we kind of teed up within the ISO, is that there are these myriad of Section 422 requirements. There's the $100,000 cap. If, for whatever reason, let's say we have a incentive stock option plan and we exceed that $100,000 limit, anything beyond that is going to be treated as a non-statutory stock option and have the same type of tax treatment that Brian just discussed on the example. So it's important to note that this is almost regarded as the default status for stock options. It's also a unique advantage that there isn't a built-in holding period per se. Obviously, there's an acknowledgement that these shares will be issued pursuant to a shareholder agreement that might have some transfer restrictions on them. But that being said, within an NSO, there isn't that built-in restriction. And then then also importantly, this is a plan that could be exercised by LLCs or partnerships as a different type of equity compensation. But like what Brian discussed within the example, there is an ordinary income realization. Obviously, we know the difference between the different types of rates on long-term capital gain and ordinary treatment. Then also there's the added capacity in payroll withholding under unstatutory stock options.
Speaking as the hypothetical employee in this example, the thing the employees have to watch out for is precisely that question, the ordinary recognition. And they're going to want to pair that with some other strategic considerations. First, I'm unlikely to want to exercise that option unless I know there's an acquisitive event right around the corner that's going to bring me cash to pay the tax. Alternately, I can negotiate my employer. At that point, if I'm a key employee, manager, or maybe they're at the point where I can start to negotiate some sort of cash bonus or loan or something to ease that cash flow restriction here, because there's, from a pure tax planning standpoint, the worst kind of taxable income is the one that doesn't come with cash attached to it. So that's something the employees have to watch out for, because but they do have some room to negotiate and do some planning.
So that brings us to the final star of the show. We've talked about a number of plans here that involve actual equity, shares of the company or option to buy shares of the company. Phantom stock is another species. This is instead a contractual right to cash. And that payment is based on the price of company stock, or in the case of partnerships or LLCs, units, but it is not, in fact, shares. So let's take a look at one final example of the day. And it's still June 2020, and instead of getting some type of equity or deferred equity or a right to future equity this time, he gets 5,000 shares of Phantom stock. Now, the value at this time is $25 per share, same vesting schedule as in the first example we looked at, 20% after 1 year, and then equal installments each year until it's fully vesting. So in June 2021, 1,000 shares vest, but instead of receiving shares this time, Adam gets cash money right in his pocket. At the vesting date, the share price is $50, the company's doing well. The Phantom stock comes in two flavors. One is the full value, and one is an appreciation only right. Now, the full value is exactly what it sounds like. On vesting, you get a cash payment equal to the full value of the price per share, or the price per unit. Under appreciation only, from the grant date to the vesting date, whatever the difference is a cash payment of the amount. So in this example, under full value, $50 a share, 1,000 shares is $50,000 of ordinary income to Adam. Under appreciation only, it's the difference. So $50 minus $25 would be $5 per share times 1,000 shares is $25,000. In both cases, ordinary income, and therefore ABC would receive the corresponding deduction. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of Phantom stock? Well, typically they can be lower costs to administrate because you're dealing not with escrowing shares aside or granting an option where a person can purchase shares and then either hold the shares or sell the shares. It's just a cash payment. They're very flexible. You can base vesting, like in many of the other options, based on either time or performance, whether that be company performance or employee performance. Maybe the biggest advantage is because there's no actual equity changing hands here, you don't dilute any management or control of the company. That can kind of be a con based on employee attitude. So take, for example, the employee who's granted Phantom stock at a particular price. When they vest, the price is lower, maybe even much lower than at the grant date. And so they don't have a right to a cash payment under the appreciation only version, which is the much more common version. And so they think, well, my deferred compensation has gone significantly down, but I haven't been able to participate in management and control of the company, so I don't have influence over the price for the future payment that I'm receiving. Phantom stock has to be targeted very specifically because plans that cover company-wide or nearly company-wide, nearly all employees, can be construed as an employee retirement plan and therefore have to comply with ERISA. So you really want to use these for your key employees. And I'll let someone in the future bore you on all the intricacies of 409A, but as a deferred compensation plan, they do have to comply with 409A.
One last thing on stock plans is, what we're describing here is consistent with the theme of our event here, kind of ongoing businesses, ones that are, intend to be multi-generational, and be ongoing. Not every business is like that. Some businesses are, designed to hit a certain growth stage and sell and be done. I mean, there's an exit event built into the cake. And in some of these plans, you can also put in a provision that essentially there is no interim cash buyout. You only get your value on a change of control when we sell this thing. We're all in for a limited purpose. We're here to build this thing, we're here to sell this thing, and we'll all be on to the next. And in that environment, you can more securely, tie the taxable event to the acquisitive event and the cash. So essentially, no one gets paid until we all get paid. We all get paid when we sell the thing.
All right, so that, as I kind of mentioned at the top, these are what we think of as more of the offensive strategies. So before we move on from this, one last circle up for questions about any of these. I guess I have a question for the audience here. Have any of your companies used any of these strategies?
Well, I was going to ask, long-term incentive plan, say, please move down attached to growth. So it's like maybe a scale down on having stock, really, but it's clearly attached to the growth of the company based on our share price, right? So I guess that stock fund is called something else, right?
Sure. Right. And have you found success using that model?
It was actually acquired by some of the top talent we had in our leadership team. It was a conversation to keep them around longer for one, in the long-term stretch. And that they wanted to participate in the growth of it, see the company fourth generation kind of slowing, right, stagnant, and then they were able to kind of 4 months and move up a lot, so it was necessary to do that.
And I think way in the back is
Oh.
yeah.
Oh, years ago I worked for Best Buy and they gave us stock options. And if I was smart enough, I'd be on the beach right now. So.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about restricted covenants. This is, again, I'm thinking of it in terms of this is the defensive side of things. Adam gave us a pretty good summary of the 3 basic types at the top of the presentation, but it probably won't go into all of you. My guess is if we did a poll, well, let's just do it. Show of hands, how many of you know if you're under a restricted covenant in some form or another? Yeah, I would expect so. Probably a lot of people, and Kylie, you don't have one. I know you don't. Okay. Kylie's our marketing person. The big 3 are non-compete, which you can't go work for a company that does X, Y, or Z. The non-solicitation, as Adam mentioned, that's typically going to fall into 2 different categories. It's going to be non-solicitation of customers, non-solicitation of employees. Again, both very common. And then confidential information, so keeping certain matters secret for a certain period of time. And typically that's going to be, the formula for Coke, that type of thing. And we'll come to this more at the end, the FTC's ruling on, or proposed rule on the non-compete piece of it, to my understanding, would not affect the non-solicitation and confidential information piece of it. But with all 3 of these, and next slide we're going to talk a little bit more about this, what you don't want to do is you don't want to have a one-size-fits-all, because it's not going to be applicable to all your employees, it's not going to be applicable in all situations. Being able to enforce these types of agreements, for lack of a better term, you need to be able to show that there was some level of tailoring and that it's actually necessary to protect the business. So, we have a concept that we call the janitor rule, and that's that I would have no legitimate business reason for restricting my janitor from going and working at a competitive business. At the same time, if my CEO wanted to go be a janitor at the competitor's business, despite that fact, that may not be enforceable. So you always have to think about these covenants and be deliberate. They need to be tailored to your business, to the situation, to the employee even. So, and there's ways you can do it. where you can have appropriate levels of customization without having to write, one provision for Mike Smith, one provision for Daryl, whatever. But the point is that you need to be thoughtful and deliberate about it. So, Dan, go to the next slide. So, one of the key things to consider here is my restrictive covenant going to an employee or is it going to an owner now? Obviously, all the different strategies which we talked about in the first part, that's conferring either some sort of equity or some sort of synthetic equity. And so we would want to pair these restrictive covenants with that type of agreement. That's the defensive portion of it. And the reason why, and that's what this chart is trying to show you, if it's just an employee, I can, for example, I get a restrictive covenant on my employee, a standard non-compete. You can't go to work for a company in the injection molding industry within 50 miles of our factory for 2 years. Say that. The problem with that is if it's just an employee, this is governed by Wisconsin statute 103.465. And just to give a little bit of background, it's a case that arose in, I believe, the 50s, is that right? Where there was a restrictive covenant and the court didn't like it, didn't think it was reasonable, so when it went in and blue penciled it. It essentially rewrote the provision into something that was, in the court's mind, reasonable under the circumstances. Well, the legislature didn't like that. So they enacted 103.465 in response to that. And this is the actual statutory text here, and you can read it. I'm not going to go word for word here, but the sum and substance of this is that if you do not meet certain very, very strict requirements under the law, and those have developed through case law over time, you're going to get your restricted covenant knocked out for an employee. It's going to be unenforceable. And as I mentioned, there's no blue penciling allowed, and what's incredibly difficult for businesses in this arena is that, say for example, we've got the 3 standard restrictive covenants. I've got a non-compete, I've got non-solicitation, and I've got confidential information. Let's say, for example, my non-solicitation and my confidential information are totally fine, no problems with them, they would comply with the law. If my non-compete portion is unenforceable, that knocks out everything else. If one part of one provision is enforceable, it knocks out the whole thing. So that's why when I say you have to be thoughtful, deliberate, and you need to tailor your provision to your company, to the employee, and really to what is the legitimate protectable business interest that you're trying to do. It's not enough to just say, I'd rather not have my employees go work for my competitors. So, not the case when we're talking about restrictive covenants on ownership. So, for an owner, a restrictive covenant on an owner, so, for example, the 5 different types of equity or synthetic equity options that we were discussing here earlier, those are going to be governed by what's known as the rule of reason. And that would be what predated section 103.465. And it's simply just, it's a 3-factor test. I didn't list the factors for you. But it truly is just, is this reasonable? Are you asking for too much? And if the court thinks that you went too far with it, or this part is enforceable, but that part isn't, the court can sit there and it can change and fiddle with it to get you the restriction that you want. So you have much greater protection. And so that's why we want to make sure that we're including these, because typically you're going to give one of these types of agreements to somebody you want to be there for a long time, somebody you're going to share a lot of confidential, proprietary information with, somebody who's going to really see the guts of the business, things that you don't want getting out there, things that would be helpful to a competitor. And so for that reason, again, we're going to want to get those restrictions in the agreement. So moving down the chart here on the employee side, now these are just very generalized kind of rules of thumb. And as practitioners in this area, I can sort of look at a restricted covenant and see that's going to be a problem. That's not so. But as a general matter, anything longer than 2 years for an employee, and 2 years may not be enforceable, by the way, but anything longer than 2 years, the court is going to go, no, get it out of here. You have to be, your territorial specificity has to be pretty high, and there must be a logic to apply to it. So, for example, I couldn't restrict somebody from just working anywhere in the state. I couldn't say, if there's no reason for it, I couldn't say you can't go to work for a competitor within 25 miles of my office. What if all my customers are in Minnesota, for example? So you have to be very careful about how you do that. And as I alluded to earlier, you have to be very modest about what you're trying to restrict. You've got to make sure not to overreach, because you can lose it all. Again, not the case when we're talking about owners. When we're talking about owners here, you can be much more expansive. There are cases out there that will hold that a restriction of 5 or even 10 years on an owner who sells a portion of their, or sells their interest in the company can be restricted. And they can be restricted from entire industries. They can be restricted on if it's reasonable nationwide. You have so much more flexibility as to what you can protect in these types of ownership arrangements. And then again, we're also talking about a scenario where I have the advantage that if I miss the mark, the court's going to help me rewrite it. I'm not going to be dead in the water just because I tried to restrict it for a little too long, or I restricted too many activities, or even perhaps restricted some sort of activity that wasn't directly within this person's purview when they were with me. Again, the court's going to help me out, and I'm going to get a lot more leeway in the scenario where I'm working with an owner.
And it comes down to inherent fairness. When we look for employees, courts are protecting employees. We don't like the idea that somebody can't go make a living in this world. But in a case where, for example, I bought somebody's business for many millions of dollars, we also don't like the idea that, when that's, a lot of that's goodwill, that person would take their $5–10 million purchase price and then go set them across the street the next day and completely undermine the value proposition. So there's an inherent, fairness to the idea that we're not as worried about the guy that got gobs of cash to sell his business and knocking him out of the market as opposed to, say, a rank and file employee who needs to make a living.
Yeah. And so this is all just a way and this doesn't mean that employee non-competes, restrictive covenants have no value, they have their place. But as part of the package that we're discussing here today, for cashless growth, again, this is the defensive side. We want to make sure that we can include these things in our agreements. And then the final thing that I'm going to talk about here, and then I think we're going to get you out in time for happy hour. So, is the latest the FTC ruling that came down, I believe it was sometime in April. Product of a proposed rulemaking. It's available on the website. You can read it if you'd like. But the sum and substance of it is non-compete. So that first category of the big three would essentially be banned nationwide for all but the very, very top executives.
Policy-making folks making more than $151,000 and change per year. And so they can still have a non-compete. Non-solicitations are allowable, except to the extent that non-solicitation is so broad that a court decides it's like a non-compete, they want to strike it down. There's also a provision that, like Wisconsin law, they would make a distinction between ownership restrictions, like, for example, making an employee an owner, who, again, even though they're an employee, now they're kind of an owner, and they would be potentially getting, a large, buyout for those shares, which could justify a covenant. The goofy thing about the FTC rule is they only would recognize that if the ownership interest is 25% or more. Well, there's a mathematical problem with that. That means I can only have 4 owners in the business. And so if I have, say, 5 equal owners at 20%, that would seem I'm now falling outside the FTC rule, and there's just not a good justification for that.
So As Adam alluded to, there's a lot of complexity here. You can go look at the rule if you'd like. Now, the reason why I'm not going further into it is this is my prognosticating. I think the chances of this rule surviving and making it into law are very, very low. It doesn't have an effective date until September 4th of this year. And I can't remember the actual case, but the late Justice Anthony Scalia had a saying about statutes that Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes. The justification that the FTC has used for this rulemaking procedure represents what would be a fairly large expansion of its power. It's claiming the right to do it, and I believe right now there's at least 4 challenges working their ways through the courts. The likelihood of an injunction prior to that effective date of September 4, 2024 is, in my, again, don't gamble based on anything that I say, but an injunction issuing before that date is, in my mind, almost a certainty. This has, for years, been a state-level issue. And as you can see, Adam alluded to at the top, all different states have different solutions to this. And whether you think any one state's solution is good, bad, or indifferent, that's not really the point. This has been a province for the state law largely to this.
The one that doesn't get as much aspect, hasn't got a lot of attention just yet, but if for some reason there is not a nationwide injunction by September 4th, putting aside the effectiveness of whatever remains of your non-competes, the other obligation that's buried in this thing is all employers are going to have a duty to give a notice to all their current and former employees that their non-compete may not be enforceable, and the failure to give that notice will be an independent violation. And so a lot to unpack still, figured out in further regs and rules as to how that notice is going to be given and what's going to be entailed, especially tracking down former employees and the like. There's some rules on being able to give a mass communication for that. So again, if this doesn't actually get, I don't know anybody's putting notice out yet at this point. I think it was going to wait till a lot closer to September 4th. But that's going to be the more immediate decision point, inflection point for employers is, to give a notice to all your current and former employees about, the potential effect of the non-competes. But I've not seen anybody send that notice yet. I think everyone's waiting until much, much closer to the time they have to give it.
And just the notice obligation notwithstanding, if it ever comes to pass, I would not, and your opinion might differ, I'll budget for that, but I would not be dissuaded from still entering into these types of covenants up until that date. And if at that time it would go into place, you deal with it at that time. But these restrictive covenants, the law varies depending on the situation, but they need oftentimes what's known as separate consideration. So you need to be giving something up. So if I enter into one of these agreements thinking, the FTC is going to ban these types of covenants, and then later it doesn't, and I want to just go back and say, okay, now you're going to also bind yourself to these restrictive covenants. One, if I'm an employee, why would I do that? But 2, it's not necessarily supported by what they call separate consideration. So I may need to give some sort of extra concession. I may need to give some sort of bonus or incentive to the employee to enter into it. So despite the fact that this September 4th date is barreling down on us, I would not use that as a reason not to put these types of covenants in there. If they end up being unenforceable, you can deal with that at the time. So I think we've got enough time for a few questions here. If anybody had anything.
No matter where the restrictive covenants are, for instance, we sign a shareholder agreement that says, obviously, we're going to count, and some of the paragraphs in that shareholder agreement will be issued as manifesto there, as opposed to a separate document, so we watch there, so to speak, in bylaw documentation. for the corporation.
You're saying, does it matter if you have the actual covenant as part of a separate agreement or part of the?
Correct.
No, and especially in an ownership situation, shareholder agreements is a great place to put the restricted covenants and underscore that it has nothing to do with the employment, it has everything to do with the ownership. So I love putting them inside of an operating agreement or a shareholder agreement.
And that is something that courts will look at when they're looking at enforceability is, although you have framed this as an ownership interest, is that truly the case? Is this really an employment agreement and you're just disguising it to try and take advantage of all the things that have been discussed as it relates to the looser restrictions on ownership at go. Anything else? All right, well, we're going to be around.
Oh, lawyers, no other questions?
Yeah, you're never going to get this much free legal advice again, so. No, I guess we should actually make that point. That this was informational only, obviously. We don't have a client relationship, but we're happy to discuss these or any other topics with you if you so like. We'll be around. We really appreciate everybody coming out. Yeah, on behalf of everybody at the firm, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.